I'm 92 years old, and if there's something I can tell you with absolute clarity today, it's this. Getting involved with someone after 60 may feel like a second chance, but most of the time, it's where you make the same mistake again, just with less time to realize it. It took me a long time to understand that, far too long. My name is Arthur Pendleton, and for years I believed the problem was that I had chosen the wrong person, but it wasn't. The mistake was in the reason why I chose. There's a huge difference between wanting companionship and accepting anything just to avoid feeling alone. And that's exactly where everything starts to go wrong. What I'm about to tell you is not about love, it's about illusion. Because the most dangerous thing isn't getting involved too late. It's getting involved without realizing what's driving you from within. And when you finally understand that, you've usually already lost too much time to go back. I met her on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that promises nothing. I was sitting in a small cafe near my house, trying to pass the time like I did every day. The place was quiet, with only a few people, and I already recognized the faces that came and went. Until that day, someone different sat at the table next to mine. She started a conversation in a simple, effortless way, as if she had known me for years. She commented on the weather, on how calm the place was, and within minutes we were already laughing about small things. I didn't feel that immediate spark people often describe, but I felt something that, at my age, seemed more valuable: comfort. It had been a long time since I felt that way. It wasn't about passion or excitement, it was about not being alone in that moment. And for someone who has already passed 60, that carries a weight many younger people don't understand. Her presence filled a space I had grown used to ignoring. In the days that followed, I started going back to the same cafe, always at the same time. At first I told myself it was just a coincidence, but deep down, I knew I was hoping to see her again. And when that started happening more often, it stopped being chance and became routine. That's when everything truly began. Not with a clear decision, nor with any defined intention, but with small encounters that seemed harmless. And that's exactly how this kind of story starts. Without warning, without intensity, and precisely because of that, far too easy to let happen. Over time, those conversations stopped being just casual encounters and began to take up space in my routine. I started to look forward to that moment of the day as if it were the only thing that truly belonged to me. There was no pressure, no expectations, and that made me believe that finally I was living something light, something different from anything I had experienced before. I told myself that this time I was more experienced, that in your 60s you don't make the same mistakes anymore. I believed I was choosing better, being more rational, more aware. But the truth is, I was simply more willing to accept less, as long as it filled the emptiness I was feeling. She didn't make big promises, didn't create unrealistic expectations, and maybe that's why I felt safe. But that sense of safety didn't come from the relationship itself. It came from the absence of conflict. And when you confuse peace with the absence of problems, you start ignoring things that deep down should have made you stop. I began to justify small inconsistencies, behaviors that didn't match what she said, absences I pretended not to notice. Nothing was big enough to push me away, but everything put together was more than enough to warn me. Even so, I chose to stay. Because when you believe you're living a second chance, You do everything you can not to see that you might be repeating the same pattern. And that's exactly what happened to me. At first, they were almost invisible details, things that on their own seemed too small to matter. Sometimes she would disappear for days without much explanation, then come back as if nothing had happened. I noticed, of course, but I told myself that everyone has their own way, their own timing, their own priorities. There were also moments when the stories didn't quite add up. Small contradictions, vague answers, subtle changes in behavior. Nothing direct, nothing you could point to with certainty. And maybe that's exactly why I chose not to dig deeper. It was easier to maintain the feeling of calm than to face the doubt. I started adjusting my behavior to avoid any discomfort. I avoided asking questions, avoided bringing up certain topics, even avoided showing when something bothered me. Without realizing it, I was shaping the relationship so it would keep working, even if that meant slowly disappearing within it. Time went on, and what used to be small signs started to become a pattern. But when something repeats itself slowly, you get used to it. And when you get used to it, you stop questioning it. That's how I drifted away from reality without noticing, step by step, without rupture, without impact. And that's the most dangerous point, because it's not a big disappointment that traps you, it's the small concessions you make every single day. Before you realize it, you're too involved to leave without feeling like you're losing something, even though, deep down, you've been losing for a long time. It was only much later that I was able to see clearly what was really happening. The problem was never that person, nor the way they behaved. The problem was what I was willing to accept, just to avoid going back to where I started, alone, in silence, facing a life I didn't want to revisit. There's a lie that almost no one talks about once you're past 60. They say any new beginning is already a victory, that having someone by your side, in any way, is better than having no one. But that's not true, because it's not someone's presence that resolves loneliness. It's the quality of what you choose to live with. It took me time to understand this, but once I did, it became impossible to ignore. The truth is simple and uncomfortable. When you enter a relationship trying to fill a void, you're not choosing, you're accepting. And when you accept, you give up standards you would never have given up before. And that's exactly what I did. I wasn't there because the relationship made sense. I was there because it helped me avoid a feeling I didn't want to face. And when you make decisions based on what you're trying to avoid, you almost always end up trapped in something you should have avoided. If I could sum it all up in one sentence, it would be this. It's not about finding someone after 60. It's about not losing yourself just to avoid feeling alone. Because in the end, that kind of trade always comes at a cost, and it almost always arrives too late. Sometime later, I met a man named Robert. He was in his early 70s, widowed for nearly a decade, and carried that same silence I recognized in myself. We started talking on a park bench, one of those simple conversations that, little by little, become deeper without you even noticing. He told me he had also met someone. At first, he described it with a kind of restrained enthusiasm, like someone who doesn't want to seem naive, but still believes deep down. He talked about companionship, about having someone to share the day with. But as the conversation went on, his tone began to change. The pauses grew longer, and his words started to carry weight. Robert began to reveal small discomforts he had never said out loud. He said he often felt out of place, as if he were constantly trying to adjust to the other person's rhythm. He mentioned avoiding certain topics, choosing to agree just to prevent tension, and, before he realized it, he no longer knew what was a choice and what was adaptation. The most striking moment was when he told me, almost like a confession, that he wasn't happy, but also couldn't leave. Not because he was deeply in love, but because he was afraid of returning to the emptiness that existed before. That wasn't a relationship that fulfilled him. It was a relationship that kept him from facing what was missing. In that moment, I saw myself in him with a clarity I had been avoiding until then. Different stories, different people, but the same pattern. And that's when I began to realize the problem wasn't individual. It was something that repeats itself, quietly, in many lives like ours. But it wasn't just through him that I realized this. Sometime later, a woman named Helena started going to the same cafe I used to visit. Unlike Robert, she didn't seem lonely at first glance. She was well dressed, spoke with confidence, and carried herself like someone who had always known how to handle life on her own. We began talking little by little, and during one of those conversations, she mentioned a marriage she had started after turning 60. She said that, at the time, she believed she was finally making a more mature choice. Without impulse, without illusions, everything seemed stable, predictable, and because of that, comfortable. But as she opened up more, it became clear that this comfort came at a cost. She told me that, over the years, she had gradually set aside things she liked, opinions she held, even parts of her own personality, not because she was forced to, but to maintain the harmony she believed was essential at that stage of life. The most striking moment was when she admitted that, for a long time, she had confused stability with happiness. She thought that not arguing, not questioning, not confronting meant that everything was fine. But deep down, she knew she was living a diminished version of herself just to avoid the risk of losing that structure. And listening to that, I understood something even deeper. It doesn't matter whether a relationship seems calm or complicated. When you enter it out of fear of losing, you've already started by giving up more than you should. And over time, that gap keeps growing until you barely recognize yourself within your own life anymore. It wasn't an argument, nor a dramatic event that changed everything at once. It was a simple moment, almost silent. I was at home, sitting alone after yet another meeting that, on the surface, seemed normal. But for the first time, I couldn't ignore that uncomfortable feeling that had been growing for months. I started to revisit small situations I had been overlooking, things I had accepted, words I didn't say, behaviors I tolerated just to keep that routine going. And suddenly, everything came together in a way I could no longer deny. It wasn't about her. It was about me and what I had allowed. That's when the hardest part came. It wasn't recognizing that the relationship wasn't right. It was realizing how long I had already known it. The pain wasn't in the present, it was in the time lost trying to sustain something that, deep down, was never whole. And that kind of realization weighs in a way that's hard to explain. In that moment, I understood I hadn't lost that relationship. I had lost time within it. And when you reach your 90s, that's the one thing you no longer have in excess. That's when everything changed, not because of courage, but because I could no longer pretend I wasn't seeing it. Today, at 92 years old, I see things with a clarity I once avoided. I stopped looking for someone to fill what I didn't want to face alone. I began to respect my own limits, to notice when something doesn't feel right, and, most importantly, to stop negotiating my peace just to have company. Now tell me, are you truly satisfied with how you're living your relationships today? What have you been avoiding questioning, even though you feel something isn't right? And deep down, what do you know really matters, but keep postponing? If this resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear this while there's still time. And subscribe to the channel, because some truths only arrive when we're willing to listen.